Welcome back, everybody. In this module, we're going to be continuing our discussion of physical changes that take place throughout the lifespan, but we're going to focus our attention this time on physical changes that happen after birth. As you probably recall, our last module spent a lot of time talking about prenatal development and some of the physiological changes that were really critical so we could be born at a specific weight and height and have specific characteristics present. Well, we're going to now look at the journey we all take after birth and how that continues throughout our lifespan in terms of physical changes that we encounter. It's probably important to first, when talking about how we change after birth, to start by talking about what we're like at birth. Now, we've talked earlier in our last class about how at birth we're relatively small and there's still a lot of development of physical features that need to take place. But how small are we and how different are we is something we didn't really quite cover. It's important to note that at birth, we're not only really small in terms of weight and height, we're usually somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds, something we'll talk about in the next slide, but our dimensions, how we're actually shaped, is extremely different from what we're like in terms of children, adolescents, and adults. One of the more noticeable differences that we see is that our head to body ratio is extremely off at birth. About a quarter of our size is dedicated to the head, and there's a multitude of different reasons for this, some of which we'll talk about in future classes when we talk about brain development and how that unfolds as we progress from infancy into childhood and beyond. But in the beginning, it does look a little unusual that our head is so much larger than the rest of our body parts. There's also, as we've mentioned before, a lot of things that still need further development, even though they're existent. We've got tiny fingers, tiny toes, very tiny legs, with very little musculature there, and more importantly, as we're going to discuss later, very few nerves connecting those muscles to the brain, so we have almost no control over a large portion of our body at birth. This is also true for our ability to utilize the senses that we're slowly developing. We're going to talk a little bit later about some of the sensory skills that are present at birth, but no, for the most part, we're very limited in terms of our moving ability, in terms of our ability to detect the environment around us, and our shape and physical makeup internally is dramatically different from what we're going to become as children, teens, and adults. At birth, essentially 95% of us are, as I mentioned, around 5 to 10 pounds and usually around 18 to 22 inches long. There's obviously exceptions to this. Some of them are genetic in nature, where people are just born to family members that have a proclivity for being very tall or very short or very heavy or very light. But typically when we look at exceptions to the norms, especially the ones that are more robust, what we tend to link them to is some type of genetic abnormality where there's some type of birth defect or problem that needs to be assessed and maybe addressed pretty quickly. Or we're looking at something that is atypical in terms of the kind of birthing timeline that we discussed in our previous class. Most children under 5 pounds of weight tend to be premature children. That could be simply a random event or linked to some of the genetic or chromosomal problems that we talked about earlier, or be linked to some of the other prenatal issues that we discussed in our last class. Things like exposures to teratogens while inside the womb, or some of the mother's dietary intake could impact birth weights, both in terms of very low birth weights and very high birth weights. And something that has been very well established over the years, the persistence of smoking can greatly impact the birth weight of children, usually making them significantly lighter than the rest of the population. This has lots of ramifications for future growth, but for most children, if they're within that 5.5 to 10 pound range, they're going to grow and change in a fairly predictable pattern after this birth. What we tend to see is within the first 2 years of life, most children usually go somewhere between 2 to 5 times greater increase in terms of their weight, and their height usually doubles roughly from where they're born. Of course, there's big exceptions to this based on the weight and height of a child. A 10-pound child is not going to see a 5-fold increase in weight and be a 50-pound 2-year-old. That's extremely unlikely. And a child that's, say, in the upper portion of the height is not going to double in their height usually, unless they're really genetically predispositioned to be extremely tall in comparison to their peers. So these doublings and 2 to 5 times increases are sometimes kind of subjective to the person themselves. But what we tend to see is most of us, once we're born, tends to develop in a fairly predictable pattern within our first 2 years, where we're all pretty much the same height and weight, plus or minus a few inches. In fact, when you look at percentiles in terms of height and weight, what you'll notice with many children, newborn children and young toddlers, is that just a half inch or an inch can mean multiple percentiles, sometimes 20 to 50 percentiles, in terms of where a child ranks amongst their peers. And this is because most kids are relatively stable when we look at the first 2 years of life, after you control for things like prenatal births, some of the teratogens and other environmental factors that take people really off the traditional track. After about 2, though, things start to change. Most children tend to slow down in their increase in height and weight, so they're not doubling their weight every couple years. Instead, it's a much more gradual shift. Their proportions start to change in ways that make them a little bit more proportional in comparison to the younger children. And in fact, this is one of the ways that many people can kind of implicitly recognize that a child is progressing past infancy into early childhood, is when you see them becoming more proportional with their heads to body ratios and the length of their arms and legs. And what we also see at around this age is that a lot of the kind of individual differences between kids start to become apparent. We see taller kids and shorter kids and larger kids and smaller kids. And a lot of these differences that we start to see are both a byproduct of genetic predispositions and environmental factors. Numerous studies have shown that the diets of young children can greatly impact how one child differs from another when they get into around 4 or 5 years of age. And what we do see is that a lot of these things can be either kind of environmentally caused at this moment, or be more of a continuation of what these children have encountered earlier that just keeps manifesting itself and creating even bigger differences from one child to another. Numerous studies have also focused in recent years on the impact of physical development based on physical activity. We're going to talk a little bit later about the growth in specific types of motor skills, and we're going to talk a lot about this use it or lose it principle. What we tend to see with young kids is some of them really progress fast at this age, and a lot of their physical skills and hand-eye coordination and strength, if they're extremely active. For the ones that are relatively sedative, not doing very much, or sedate, sorry, they're not necessarily going to see much growth in those areas. And we'll revisit this a little bit later when we go beyond just talking about physical changes that are happening. But I do want to kind of mention that idea because it is interlinked between the kind of physical overall changes that we see in growth at around this age. Once we get past about 6, what we see is that proportional build, those changes, start to become even more apparent for many children. In fact, children at around 6, 8, 10 start looking less and less like little tiny infants and more like tiny adults. And in fact, as the proportional change is starting to take place, oddly enough, the kind of physical growth that we tend to think of as a critical part of childhood starts to slow down even more. In fact, it's often called the dormant stages of growth during the 6 to 11 year age range, where the kids will gain maybe an inch or 2 per year, which is proportionally versus in the early times, much less change in growth in height and weight, and they also gain somewhere between 5 and 7 pounds per year. Again, this being highly dictated by the environment that kids are exposed to and some of the things that they're doing on a daily basis. We see, in terms of other changes in the body, much greater growth in muscle mass and bone development for most kids at about this age. But again, this can be highly specific to the child and the environment that they encounter, to where by the time kids get to about 11 years of age, we start to see some of the dramatic individual differences that we see reflected in adolescents and adults based on how active and of how exposed to things they are at specific ages. Now, at our age 11, or maybe a little bit before it, depending upon the individual, we start to undergo a pretty dramatic change in terms of physical growth. The dormancy period sort of comes to an end, and we start to undergo this thing that many of us probably can reflect upon fairly easily, called puberty. This area typically is marked by lots of social and mental and emotional changes that we can talk about in future discussions. But it's important to note here that when we look at it from a biological perspective, what we're looking at is something that's started through just a change internally in the body. In particular, a change in the abundance and production of these chemicals circulating through our bloodstreams called hormones. We have very specific chemicals that are used by cells in our nervous system called neurons so they can communicate with each other. But we also have very similar chemicals that circulate through our bloodstream that activate different organs and parts of our bodies. And these chemicals are the things that we call hormones. For puberty, the first hormone that starts to get secreted at a much higher rate is a specific type of hormone called gonadotropin-releasing hormones, or GnRH. These specific hormones are circulated through specific regions of the brain that actually activate other regions of the brain, other what we call glands, that then secrete other types of hormones throughout our bloodstream and eventually to other parts of our body. The specific gland that's really critical in puberty is something called the pituitary gland. It's actually located in an area that secretes a bunch of different types of chemicals to the body throughout our lifetime. But when we talk about puberty, the ones that are really critical are the ones that activate our areas down in our lower regions called our gonads. These specific structures in our lower regions for both genders, or for all genders, start to produce massive amounts of chemicals that we call hormones. For women, there's a huge uptick in the specific chemicals of estrogen, or sometimes called estradiol, and testosterone. Most people tend to pair testosterone with the puberty experiences of males, but it's important to note here that testosterone is really critical for physical development of both men and women. It has a dramatic impact on changes in bone density and muscle density and lots of other kind of physical changes that we're going to be talking about in the next slide. But if we're looking at the thing that's more abundant in women and a critical player in some of the sexual changes that happen for women that we're going to be talking about in the next slide, it's the increase in estrogen or estradiol that we tend to focus on as researchers. And for women, we tend to see these hormones being secreted by the gonads at a little bit earlier period than what we tend to see for most males. So some women can start to experience the earlier, slower changes in puberty at somewhere around ages 9, 10 years of age, even though most typically start to experience some of the slow, gradual changes at around 11 years of age and beyond. For men, it takes a little bit longer to start, but when puberty hits for most males, when the gonads are activated, the increase in testosterone is not just doubling, but usually around an 8-fold increase. It's obviously varies from individual to individual, to a small extent, but there's still a pretty dramatic increase in testosterone production in most males once they start to undergo puberty. And much like for women, when there is an increase in testosterone in addition to the estrogen, for males the same is true. There's just a much smaller, very incremental change in the estrogen produced by males as they're undergoing puberty. And again, a slightly later age than most women, but a much more rapid change in hormones tends to occur for males when they start to undergo puberty. Now, what happens during puberty beyond just the changes in hormones? As I mentioned, usually what we tend to tie to puberty is the changes in sexual abilities and sexual kind of physical characteristics. Usually when people talk about puberty, their focus when just discussing the natural process of it is the fact that people become reproductively capable by the time they reach puberty or they're working through puberty, and they start to develop the very notable primary sex characteristics that both males and females need in order to reproduce. But there's a bunch of additional things that happen in pairing with this dramatic increase in testosterone, estrogen, and other more mild hormones that are circulating through the body as we're undergoing puberty. Males tend to see a dramatic increase in muscle mass as a byproduct of the dramatic increase in testosterone that they're experiencing. Women tend to actually see changes in their skeletal structure, and usually higher levels of fat content start to emerge throughout the body, but in particular in some of the primary sex characteristic areas. We also see an increase in what we call secondary sex characteristics, where voices of both males and females tend to change and become a little bit deeper. The presence of hair becomes very abundant in numerous places in the body for both men and women, and changes to the skin occur. And when we're talking about changes to the skin occurring, it's not just that you suddenly became oily and acne-ridden by the time you reach puberty. There's other changes to the skin that are taking place as well. And these changes are really kind of big hallmarks to the byproduct of the hormonal changes that are happening within the body. It might not necessarily be the most desirable thing for some of us to undergo some of these puberty changes, but these are natural processes in life that make us ready for childbearing and theoretically adulthood. Now, if we're looking at what triggers this change in puberty, there's a lot of research that's still parsing through the variety of different things that seems to be the triggers for specific individuals. We know that environmental factors do matter. We know that social and emotional stressors can impact how early or late somebody develops in puberty. But trying to untangle this on an individual by individual basis is an extreme challenge. That being said, developmental psychologists do have some things that they've looked at specifically when it comes to puberty onset that's worth noting. One of the things that's really troubling and of great interest to many researchers is the increased abundance of a specific type of puberty that we call precocious puberty. Not only early onset of puberty for certain children, but the very rapid pace and change that children undergo when they experience this thing that we call precocious puberty. What researchers have focused their attention on is the fact that this is a specific phenomenon that seems to be happening more and more often, and in particular, more and more often for girls in recent decades. This particular experience might just be kind of a weird phenomenon, if not for the fact that the impacts of precocious puberty are abundantly clear to many, not only biological researchers, but social psychologists as well. Numerous studies have shown that girls undergoing precocious puberty have a much higher rate of risky behavior and emotional social problems as they undergo these puberty changes. Now, there is obviously some correlation since there is links to stress and environmental factors in the onset of precocious puberty that can't be necessarily controlled for perfectly when trying to figure out if it's the precocious puberty causing some of the riskier behaviors and emotional social problems, or they're just kind of a byproduct of the continued environment that these people are experiencing. But most researchers doing the data and running the studies have suggested that it seems pretty clear that precocious puberty is having an impact on these children that goes beyond just the environment that was triggering the precocious puberty in the first place. What's more troublesome to many researchers looking at this is not just a tumultuous time for a year or two for many of these children, especially the girls, as everybody catches up. It seems to be a persistent thing that lasts throughout a large portion of life, if not the entire life, of many of the children that undergo precocious puberty. Numerous studies have correlated precocious puberty with issues in terms of school performance, choices in life where there's maybe kind of early actions or impulsive behaviors that can come back to cause problems later on. Friendships are often very tough for children who undergo precocious puberty to maintain, and there kind of are persistent emotional social problems that tend to be correlated with children who experience early onset puberty, or what we would call precocious puberty. Now again, it's really challenging to tease apart whether or not these things are a byproduct of precocious puberty or the environment that these children are being exposed to. And it's also really important to note that undergoing precocious puberty does not guarantee that you are destined to have large numbers of problems throughout your life, or not undergoing precocious puberty kind of staves you away from having to worry about having issues in terms of school and impulsivity and other emotional social problems. But the correlations are abundant, and trying to figure out what the source of precocious puberty is and how these things are impacting people in such a dramatic way is something that is of particular interest for a large percentage of the population, and is something that many people are working on still today, even though this has been something we've been acutely aware of at this point for many decades. It's also important to note that a lot of these things that we're finding are not very common for boys who undergo precocious puberty. And trying to tease out why these effects are so dramatically different from one gender to the other is again another topic of interest and discussion by many developmental psychologists trying to understand the unfolding process better. And once we get through puberty into what some psychologists call post-puberty and start progressing into adulthood, what we tend to see is really a slow, gradual changing process that starts to take place. Essentially, we get to a point where we're no longer growing and instead maintaining until things start to kind of fall off in the later years of life. Usually it's until about our mid-20s that we're growing slightly taller, and then around our 30s, our body slowly starts to what we'll say decline. Not necessarily the best word, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but the body is no longer in what we would consider a growing process. When we talk about decline, there's lots of types of decline that occur. What we tend to see is that fat is more easily clustered in specific areas of the body, and there are lots of individual differences as to where fat starts to cluster, but usually when we get into our 30s, we start to see an abundance of it, and it's much easier to store fat as adults in our 30s than when we're younger. We also see that our bodies do tend to shrink due to compression thanks to gravity and other changes in the body that tend to cause men to lose about an inch between the ages of 25 to 75, and women to lose about 2 inches in that same time span. There's also the noticeable loss of fat on what we call the epidermis level under the skin, which results in the prevalence of wrinkles that start to become more and more abundant in our later ages as this fat starts to leave our skin, or collagen starts to leave our skin as we progress throughout lifespan. In addition to losing the kind of plumpness in the skin when we get into our 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, What we also see is that the skin is a little bit less elastic and more capable of tearing. This tends to cause individuals as they get older to not only be more easily cut, but tends to kind of take longer to recover from minor cuts and scrapes that people can shrug off in their 20s and 30s. In addition to these changes on the skin level, structurally, we see shifts as well. We do tend to lose our muscle mass and our muscle elasticity as we get older, but as we're going to talk about a little bit later, these declines in muscle mass and elasticity are highly dependent upon the activity levels of an individual. Some individuals can start to lose their muscle mass and elasticity in their late 20s, early 30s. Others can progress throughout their lives all the way into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and due to their increased levels of activities, maintain a lot of their muscle mass and activity. But it's important to note that to contain or to maintain that muscle mass and elasticity in your 50s, 60s, and beyond, there is a need to increase activity levels and really be mindful of how you can maintain these things, simply because it's tougher to do as we get older. As our muscles are changing, so is the structure of our bone. And if we're talking about structures of our bone, we also can see within the bones themselves that the density starts to kind of fade. We're going to talk a little bit later about something called ossification of bones and how this is a critical thing, but note overall that as we're progressing past our teenage years into our 20s and beyond, our bones are becoming slightly smaller and slightly less dense with each and every passing year, even though the change is not necessarily a linear one. As I mentioned, as we change from adulthood into late adulthood and beyond, the change is not necessarily a linear one, but more of a gradual one to begin with. When we reach around 50, this is when that gradual change starts to become a little bit more abundant, apparent. And usually, if we're looking for a source of that change, it's the same source that caused the uptick in muscle mass and bone density to begin with. As our hormones start to change and start to kind of alter themselves within our bodies, we tend to see our bodies following in tow. For women, at around 50, the experience that really tends to trigger a lot of changes in bone mass and density is something called menopause. Now, menopause, much like puberty, is kind of highlighted by the change in reproductive abilities. What we do see is that women who undergo menopause lose the ability to produce eggs and usually have no ability anymore to bear children. Are kind of the unusual, exceptional phenomena that have made the news over the recent years and decades, but for the vast majority of women in the population, when they start to undergo the biological changes that trigger menopause, the hormonal changes that kind of pop up, they not only lose reproductive abilities, but a lot of the things that came with those reproductive abilities in the first place start to shift, where bone density drops, muscle density drops, and the estrogen, which produces high levels of energy and other types of side effects, starts to decline and cause other effects like hot flashes, fatigue, nausea, and other things that tend to be really kind of irritating for women who are undergoing menopause in their 50s and beyond. We also see for males who maybe don't have quite the physical change in terms of hormones, similar changes in the body in terms of muscle density and bone density, and a lot of the skin and muscle and hair changes that we mentioned earlier become more exacerbated at about this age. We also see that more physical ailments become common for individuals when they reach about this age. But it's important to note that this is an age where it's really critical to engage in physical activity and to do things to help offset some of these changes. Numerous studies have highlighted the fact that getting exercise can greatly diminish the changes that we see at around 50. And in fact, to really highlight this, I selected a video, and it's uploaded on the class site, to kind of detail, or that gives details on how important physical exercise can be when we reach this age and start to experience some of the changes that sort of naturally unfold at around 50 and beyond. And this, I think, is a good spot to stop. There's obviously more changes that we undergo in our 70s and beyond, but when we start talking about a lot of these changes, they're more about sensory skills and motor skills that are altering at those later ages. And I think that's something that we can dedicate to our attention to in our future classes. So we're going to mark the end of this video here. Make sure you watch that other video that I just referenced in the last slide. And when you come back, I'll continue this discussion of physical change that we encounter throughout our lifespan. Thank you very much for watching this. Hope you're still doing well. I hope to see you soon. Take care.